the work that I do,
Yeah.
a lot of the focus that I try to have is on people on the ground who have suffered exposures to radiation and the way those populations are managed.
Huh.
And a lot of my work has been at nuclear test site communities. The UK never tested inside the UK. France never tested inside France. The places where where the nuclear states do nuclear testing is in marginal areas or colonial areas or post-colonial areas. The people there are exposed to fallout. They don't have the same experience as people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're exposed to residual radiation, to particles, and they're ignored. The health problems they have are largely ignored. And I had thought that when Fukushima happened, now you have a large amount of people in a modern, highly technological, wealthy nation having a similar exposure to the people in the test site communities. And I had hoped that this might bring more attention to the plight of people who are suffering from residual radiation, from fallout. But it's just really not happened at all. And the people in Fukushima are being forgotten as quickly as the people in Kazakhstan and the people in French Polynesia and the people in the Marshall Islands. My work focuses on people like this. No matter how many treaties we sign, no matter how much money we put into recovery of Fukushima, the people that are exposed to radiation just end up being completely forgotten.
You are listening to TMI for the week of December 25th, 2017.
This week, Dave talks to author Robert Jacobs, a professor at Hiroshima City University, Hiroshima Peace Institute, graduate faculty of international studies in Japan, about technopolitics and the burden of nuclear power and atomic weapons.
Hi there, Robert. It's Dave Archer calling from TMI.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, how are you?
Oh, good. Actually, I'm trying to use my headphones. Let me see if I can get this rigged.
Sure.
Hold on.
Take your time.
How's your day going?
It's been okay. The whole holiday thing, it can get a bit hectic. It's not for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. I'm Jewish, so Christmas is never a big deal for me.
Yeah.
Living here in Japan, it's everywhere, but it's totally secular.
Mm-hmm.
But Monday will be Christmas Day. It's still a working day.
Okay. Really? For everybody? So it's not a big holiday?
No, actually, today is a holiday. Today's the Emperor's birthday, but it's Saturday, so most people are off anyway.
It's kind of weird. No matter how much you try not to participate in it, it still has some kind of weird effect. I'm like, hey, how come I feel a little weird? And it's like, oh, it's Christmas time. It must be. Not that I have, I don't have any reason to, be a Grinch, but it also marks the change of the year. People like me probably overdo it all year round. And then, this is actually pretty important break time, I think. Reset, start fresh in January. Right. Yeah?
Yeah. Well, that's definitely, since so much of the society revolves around this date, there's, as you say, there's really no way to sort of avoid the effects that it has on your life, even just in sort of regulating, and of course it's close to New Year's and all.
Yeah. I want to ask you, what is technopolitics?
It's actually a term that I'm not sure where it was coined, but I've come to understand it through the work of Gabriel Hecht, the historian at Stanford, used to be at University of Michigan, now at Stanford, but sort of the politics of how technology is used. So for me, I say that I work on radiation technopolitics. In other words, how our understanding of radiation is frequently as much politically constructed as it is scientifically constructed.
Huh. The Hiroshima Peace Institute, that's part of the Hiroshima City University?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a research faculty inside the university. It was originally a standalone peace institute. When I first came, we were employees of Hiroshima City Hall. But then over the last 7 or 8 years, our university was moved on to Hiroshima City University campus, and we became university employees instead.
There's a lawsuit afoot challenging some plants that are near volcanoes. And it seems to stem out of Hiroshima City, but is that connected to the university?
No, not at all. It's actually just that it's the district court that the local decision on the next island over, Shikoku, where this plant is located. The appeal of the decision there went up to the district court, which for this area is located here. So it's really kind of coincidental that it was in Hiroshima. It doesn't really have anything to do with any institutions outside of the Japanese judiciary.
We don't get a lot of news from Japan here, but I just noticed there was a story about parts falling off planes heading for Okinawa. How much of an irritant is U.S. military and Japanese life?
Well, it's a complicated issue. It has long been an irritant in Japanese life for the same reasons that large military bases always cause social impacts around where the bases are located. Part of what's happened here in Japan is that there's an internal kind of colonialism. You know, Okinawa was held by the U.S. after World War II, but when it was returned to Japan, I think this was in the 70s, as there were problems around U.S. military bases, crimes committed by soldiers and so forth, who are not allowed to be charged in Japanese court because of status of force agreements. The Japanese national government has slowly been moving as many military bases as possible to Okinawa, so that it is a problem for Okinawan people rather than main island Japanese people. So in Okinawa, there's a lot of base construction. A lot of Okinawa is, I think it's a quarter of the land space is U.S. military bases in Okinawa. And so there's huge opposition in Okinawa. The Okinawan prefecture has elected a governor that, who was elected on an anti-base platform. And it's probably at least once a month that we have news stories of a soldier who has had a drunk driving accident or sexual assault or some kind of malfeasance like this. And so it's in Okinawa, it causes quite an uproar, but partly because more and more bases have been moved there. In the rest of Japan, it's frequently ignored. In this case, you have equipment. You have part of a helicopter that simply fell from the helicopter as it was flying. And Okinawa has also been a staging area for a lot of U.S. military activity. Well, for example, all of the Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam was staged in Okinawa before being brought to Vietnam. And so there's contamination there from the Agent Orange as it was being warehoused. So it's for people in Okinawa, it's a very, very serious issue, and for peace activists on the left in Japan, it's a serious issue. But outside of that, it really doesn't get so much press coverage even throughout most of Japan.
I think most people, and definitely myself, don't really understand how responsibility is separated between Japan and the U.S. as it relates to military, and I guess as it relates to nuclear. Some people would debate whether there's a big connection there or not. But in terms of the policy, is there a strategic role for Japan in terms of nuclear? Do they stage nuclear strategy from Okinawa?
Well, there's some interesting controversy around that. Everywhere that the U.S. has a military base in a foreign country, the United States tries to negotiate SOFA, which is a status of force agreement. So in other words, if soldiers commit a crime, this is part of the status of force agreements. If a soldier commits a crime, the adjudication of that crime is within the U.S. military judicial system rather than in the local judicial system, depending on the level of the crime. So these treaties are negotiated with each country. The United States was the occupying power of Japan for 7 years after World War II and has had military bases here since the end of the war. And so there's fairly developed status of force agreements here in Japan and in places like South Korea, previously the Philippines. These become complicated, when crimes are committed. But in terms of nuclear staging, the Japanese government has had a policy that no nuclear weapons are allowed inside Japan or Japanese territorial waters. This is long-standing since Japan became independent again after the occupation. But slowly it's come out over the years that there has been a tacit agreement to allow U.S. ships with nuclear weapons into ports in Japan. And that caused a little bit of a scandal when the press and people realized that Japan has sort of been allowing nuclear weapons to be present in Japan for decades. There's just now some increased awareness about this, partly because of the book that was just published by Daniel Ellsberg. And what is it, The Doomsday Machine? It was just published about his work as a nuclear strategist prior to his work as an analyst on the Vietnam War. And one of the things that Ellsberg mentions in the book, and he had mentioned this elsewhere, was that beyond the fact that most U.S. ships, military ships that came to port in Japan, most, according to Ellsberg, did have nuclear weapons on them. He also talks about how at near one of the Marine bases in Iwakuni, which is about 20 miles away from here in Hiroshima, for decades, there was a large landing vessel, like a kind of a naval boat that would land and allow tanks, to come off it, that stored significant quantity of nuclear weapons for decades, just anchored a few hundred yards off the beach in a town, Iwakuni, where the Marine base was, so that if there was war with Russia or China, nuclear weapons could be moved from this barge to the airplanes at Iwakuni in 30 minutes. Right. This was, starting in the 1950s. So it's slowly coming out that Japan has been a major staging area for American nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War.
And its role, Japan, it's an important perch considering its location. What autonomy does Japan have in terms of protecting itself in a military way?
Well, the Constitution that was approved and adopted after the occupation was largely written by the United States. And inside that Constitution, there's an article, Article 9, in which Japan declares that it will not have a military, that it will not participate in wars, it will not prepare for any kind of foreign aggression, and it will not maintain a standing military. So this is Article 9 is often called the pacifist clause of the Japanese Constitution, and there's a tremendous amount of pride and support still for it in Japan. However, during the Korean War, which was just, at the beginning of the occupation and right at the point where Japan became an independent nation again, a lot of the U.S. military that was based here in Japan at that time was moved over to Korea for warfighting purposes. And in a sense, the notion that Japan was left sort of defenseless facilitated the emergence of the self-defense forces, the SDF, as a de facto military. It's always been claimed that it's only for self-defense. It's not for aggression. It's not for participation in any kind of foreign endeavors. But it still, maintains, I believe, its 9th or 10th largest military spending in the world. So it's obviously a very significant military force. And under the recent governments, and especially the current Abe government, there has been a very concerted effort to take apart Article 9. It was reinterpreted by the Abe government. This was just a unilateral reinterpretation in which the government declared that now Japanese self-defense forces could participate in collective allied endeavors. So there was a small contingent of self-defense forces in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so the Abe government is clearly trying to move the Japanese public towards a greater acceptance of further militarization and of scrapping altogether the Article 9. So things like the hysteria over North Korea, these things just completely facilitate moves towards remilitarizing Japan.
And moving forward, will that arrangement hold? Is there, you said that there was sort of public support and pride in Article 9, but Abe might be kind of chipping away at that. So do you think that this arrangement will stay as is?
It depends how events unfold. Currently, support for Article 9 is diminishing as hysteria over North Korea increases. The government has been doing things like stopping all train traffic in Tokyo whenever North Korea tests a missile.
Mm-hmm.
This is essentially a kind of a feeder to increase anxiety. There's been distribution of pamphlets about what to do if there's a nuclear attack. All of these sort of theatrical steps increase anxiety, increase support for the notion that Japan needs to militarize. And I would also add that the instability and unpredictability of American President Trump plays right into that.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that America can be relied on to defend Japan. Japan is under the nuclear umbrella and the military protection of the United States. The more people here feel that the United States is not a reliable ally, the stronger the support for militarizing will be.
I noticed there's a campaign in Hawaii that seems to be, I don't want to say fear-mongering, but there, I just did it, about, its vulnerability. It's same kind of thing, probably.
Yes, exactly. And for me, it is fear-mongering and it is theater. It's a way to manufacture anxiety to support certain policies. For example, just this notion that let's tell people what to do in case there's a nuclear attack. First of all, it feeds into the notion that a nuclear attack is a manageable event.
Right.
And that's ridiculous to begin with. But the ultimate goal of these kinds of policies, because just like, the fallout shelter movement in the United States in the Cold War, these were not things that were realistically going to protect people very much. These things are done theatrically in order to generate anxiety and support for policies. And so you're seeing that all across the board here in Japan. You're seeing it in the United States, this notion that, obviously the fact that North Korea is a nuclear armed nation is something that is a serious military thing to consider. It's being used in ways to support molding public opinion and generating anxiety. So in Hawaii, if there was a nuclear attack on Hawaii, these, putting sirens back on, distributing pamphlets, it's really not going to change the outcome.
Is it simplistic of me to imagine if China were to take a more active role with North Korea, it would kind of say America needs to have less of a presence in that region, and wouldn't that be something all the countries in that area would want?
Well, I think that the United States is going to simply maintain a huge presence in this region. It has a gigantic military presence in South Korea, gigantic military presence in Japan, a huge military presence in many of the Pacific Islands, obviously in Hawaii as well. And so China is essentially, as far as most analysts are concerned, China is doing pretty much everything it can do to try to control and restrain North Korea. So it's not as though they're unwilling to. Their influence only goes so far. But I think that the last thing that Japan or the United States really wants with these current governments is any diminished presence of the American military here in Northeast Asia.
I was going to save this till later, but I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on and ask you kind of a silly question just while we're on this. So in the weeks after the Fukushima, disaster. No news was coming out, at least none that was reliable, believable, or accurate. And so a lot of people were stuck on message boards. There's a couple physics-related message boards that were running little stories daily about presumably what was going on there. But one of the stories that I recall was pretty, detailed description or speculation as to what was in that bay that is created by the breakwater walls. It's kind of a bay in front of the plant. How contaminated it would be there. And yet there are stories of ships loading and unloading in that area in the weeks after the disaster, equipment hauling it away, covered in white tarps. And so some people would have speculated that was part of a sort of secretive military nuclear weapons program. Is that fake news? Is that crazy?
Well, I don't doubt that there was equipment being loaded and offloaded with tarps, but I don't think it was weapons related in any way.
It seems secretive the way it was described. So that's to be floating ships in that little harbor, which was contaminated beyond comprehension from the accident, to be of all times picking then to be loading and unloading mysterious materials covered in white tarps.
I remember hearing a little bit about that, but it's to me, there's nothing nefarious about it. You have a massive earthquake. You have an inability really to travel very well on roads through that region. There was destruction everywhere. You have this intense crisis going on at the plants. It's almost certainly much easier to bring needed equipment to remove things from the water than it was over land.
It might have been the best port.
Well, especially for any kind of support efforts for dealing with the meltdowns. It's fairly easy to imagine that, of course, that would be used. And it's easy also to imagine that things would be covered with tarps in order to protect them from contaminants. So, there's a lot of simple. Another thing I would add is that at a time of intense crisis where you've had 20,000 people killed, where you've had massive destruction of infrastructure, this is usually not a time when governments are able to execute secret plans in effective ways.
Wow.
Just simply keeping up with trying to stay one step ahead of disaster. It's similar to, for example, one of the things that I study primarily is nuclear weapon testing. And in the Bravo test, which was the first real usable thermonuclear weapon test by the U.S. in the Marshall Islands in 1954, it created a massive radiological disaster. Lots of Marshallese people, as well as huge amounts of American military personnel, were exposed to a gigantic fallout cloud. Included in there was a boat called, in English we call the Lucky Dragon. This was a Japanese tuna fishing boat. It's somewhat famous. It was covered with radiation, and when it got back to port a few weeks later, the entire crew was sick from radiation exposure and was hospitalized. And that's actually what broke the news of how big a radiological disaster this was. I've heard recently one or two people speculate that as the Lucky Dragon was returning to port in Japan, the United States military was trying to hunt it down and sink it so that word wouldn't get out about what happened. And that kind of speculation is silly and crazy. You have in the United States military out there in the Marshall Islands at that time, they're in massive panic mode. Their equipment and personnel are being exposed to high levels of radiation. It's difficult to operate. They're having to evacuate people. They're having to restage everything. So the notion that at moments like that, suddenly you have these unbelievably effective, nefarious plots is a little bit silly.
Thank you for dispelling my little urban myth there.
In these cases, the actual events themselves are horrifying enough. Yeah. You don't have to come up with sneaky ways they were horrifying.
I saw you tweeted, you're a big presence on Twitter, we'll mention your name at the end. The Independence. This is a ship.
Oh, yes, right. the first two nuclear tests post 1945, the United States tested nuclear weapons less than a year after the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first two tests were in the Marshall Islands in 1946. One of those tests was an underwater bomb. It's probably one of the most reproduced photographs of a mushroom cloud because it's a very heavy, wide, low-hanging mushroom cloud because there's a lot of water in it. And there's a lot of boats that you see, naval ships underneath the mushroom cloud. So what the United States had done was it had towed a lot of damaged ships from both the Pacific War and the war in Europe, both Japanese, American ships, even German ships. They had towed a lot of ships and anchored them all in the lagoon at Bikini Atoll, where they set this weapon off. And part of what they wanted to discover was if you set off a nuclear weapon underwater in a harbor, would you destroy the boats? Would you render them useless? All of these boats were brought into Bikini Atoll. And one of the things that we discovered at that test is that when you detonate a nuclear weapon underwater, a lot of the radiation that might rise up into the cloud and disperse downwind is actually held there in the water. So it really increases the local contamination. And all of these boats became very, very radioactive, partly from just sitting in the lagoon. And so the United States wanted to figure out, once you have a naval ship that is highly radioactive, can you decontaminate it or do you have to abandon it? So they towed 14 of these ships to right outside of San Francisco. They anchored them outside of San Francisco Bay. And one by one, they brought them into the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco proper and tried to decontaminate them. They tried acid washing them, sandblasting them. They tried all kinds of means of decontaminating these boats. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful. They concluded that boats that are in this condition would have to be abandoned, but through trying to decontaminate them, they spread radiation all over the Hunters Point shipyard. So it became a very radioactive Superfund site in the United States that has just in the last few years been claimed to have finally been cleaned up. The Independence was one of those boats that was brought into Hunters Point, and that helped, a lot of the radiation from that boat was spread around the shipyard. And then ultimately these 14 boats that were taken to San Francisco were all towed up near these beautiful islands off San Francisco Bay, the Farallon Islands, and they were all sunk there. That had actually been a radioactive dumping site for Livermore Lab in later years. And also in San Francisco, there was a radiological research lab separate from the Hunters Point site that was creating a lot of nuclear waste. All of this waste was taken out by the Farallon Islands and dumped, and these boats were sunk there. So they're down at the ocean floor now.
I always thought it was interesting. I don't know what you can conclude from this, that, after World War II, defeated nations like Japan and Germany suddenly took on all these GEBWRs. It doesn't seem fair. It seems kind of mean that the Americans just unloaded their, not the greatest reactors on, countries that really couldn't.
Well, this is good business for the American nuclear industry. Each reactor built lowers the costs overall. It also creates an economic dependence on American industrial companies for the power grids of the reconstructed Japan and the reconstructed West Germany. So it was as much an economic move as anything else.
I just wonder how much say the Japanese or Germans had in that, and there should be some kind of responsibility, seeing as how, there's been an accident and, somebody's got to start paying. It seems to me it's an American.
I think that, there was complicity on both sides.
Okay.
Obviously, there was complicity by the governments of the countries that were welcoming these reactors. But I mean, is your Twitter handle Price Anderson? Obviously, who's going to pay for this is the taxpayers. This is the way that that it's always constructed. Nuclear disasters, if nuclear utilities had to purchase adequate insurance to cover the liability for their accidents, none of them would be economically viable. And so you have to pass that liability off to taxpayers. TEPCO last year had a great year. Its stock did great. We'll pay for that. TEPCO will not pay for all of these costs that are incurred by the society as a whole. It will come from taxpayers. We've had a number of hikes to our taxes to fund all of the money going into both legitimate and ridiculous recovery projects up in Fukushima. But as you know, the nuclear industry is in trouble just based on its own simple economics.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll never legally allow themselves to be in a position where they have to compensate the victims of their accidents.
Isn't there a recent court case in Japan? I think it was it TEPCO being held responsible?
So I couldn't answer that with any authority, but I know as a Japanese taxpayer that we're the ones who are footing the bill.
And it's up to, the original estimate was 250, and then I think Naoto Kan at a conference in California a few years ago speculated 250 to 500, and then now I think we're hearing $650 billion.
Well, I'm sure, I'm sure none of those figures are close to what the ultimate cost will be over the course of decades.
Right.
And of course, none of those costs take into account all of the personal wealth lost by people whose homes lost value, who had to move, whose businesses have lost business. So, these kind of compensations are going to be for probably a somewhat shoddy cleanup and the contracting work done up there to, quote unquote, decommission, or rather decontaminate. So these costs aren't even a fraction of what the actual costs are to the people in the area. But when you look at the fact that there was just a new containment built at Chernobyl, which will have a shelf life and have to be replaced, the long-term costs of these things are almost unknowable. We really don't know yet how and when we'll be able to retrieve the corium, the melted fuel from these reactors, and where all of that material will ultimately be deposited. So the long-term cost of this, will be far beyond any of these estimates. That's for sure.
I'm going to put my tinfoil hat back on. So when I look at pictures, every single picture you look at of the control rooms or just any part of those plants, it's all GE everywhere, with the GE everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you see these photos with like the keys in controlled switches and stuff. And it's like, I've heard that, they were delivered as a turnkey operation by GE. And for a long time, they kept saying in the news, and the operator, TEPCO. And so I kept wondering, okay, so they're the operator. Who actually owns the actual reactors? I think that answer was, it turns out, I think it might actually be TEPCO. But for a long time, I was wondering, I wonder if GE still owns any part of that operation.
I don't know that they own it outright, but I'm not certain about that.
It has sort of implications in terms of liability.
Well, again, even for TEPCO, that liability is limited. So companies like GE, Mitsubishi, none of these companies will go forward with these projects if they have to bear the liability.
Every single country in the world, if you want to participate in nuclear, they basically give you a standard form Nuclear Liability Act, and if you don't sign it, corporations, GE, Westinghouse, whomever, Toshiba, etc., they won't do business with you.
Absolutely, and this is one of the things that's not factored into the cost of nuclear power is the subsidizing of the liability and ultimately the bearing of liability when there is a disaster. There's a massive subsidy. If other large industrial facilities could operate with no liability, it would really alter the economics of their operations.
Yeah, and get a free pass on the waste and garbage they produce.
Yeah, exactly. All of that will be paid for by taxpayers. I mean, the cliche, nuclear industry is the ultimate example of socialized risk and privatized gain.
Listen on the web, tmi.twxnet.com. There you can find our iTunes link, our email, and show notes. Also, links related to the episode. You can find us almost anywhere you find podcasts.
So, there's no solution to nuclear waste in Japan, and one of the strategies was to take the spent fuel and reprocess it and extract plutonium. And it's my understanding Japan has stockpiled huge amounts of plutonium.
Absolutely. Japan has, basically, experts believe that were Japan or, for example, South Korea or Taiwan to choose to pursue nuclear weaponry, it would probably be a 1 or 2 year project because all of them sit on massive stockpiles of plutonium. And as you know, the reprocessing has never been economically efficient.
Well, that was my next question. Manju.
Yes. I mean, part of the theory here is that if you did not maintain an operation like Manju, even if it doesn't work, even if the economics of it are ridiculous, then you would have to account for maintaining a plutonium stockpile. So things like Manju are often the necessary window dressing to stockpiling plutonium.
Mm-hmm.
If you are not a nuclear weapon state, you would have to account for, either through the NPT or various other organs, why you're stockpiling plutonium, but you can claim that because you have a program for reprocessing, this is why you're stockpiling plutonium. But rarely are these reprocessing programs functional or economic. And so I think most people who study it believe that this reprocessing is essentially a guise behind which to prepare for the possibility of becoming a nuclear weapon state.
And kind of window dressing for the waste issue itself. It's probably easy to convince people once you remove the plutonium, there's nothing wrong with the nuclear waste, which is silly.
And also that generating more nuclear waste won't create an additional problem because you have a plan to reprocess it. So it's again, not to overuse the word, but it's very theatrical. It's about creating impressions.
Yeah.
And that's technopolitics. It's about using technology to achieve political goals, or presenting technology, using technology to distract from how politics is operating.
So Atoms for Peace is a shoe-in for that definition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Atoms for Peace. I'm not sure where the peace is.
Yeah.
But and also it was a means of lowering costs for producing nuclear power plants. So for the industry, including for the weapons industry, it was smart to manufacture more of these. And it was also a form of creating a dependency on American economic companies for the electrical generation of, tons and tons of other countries.
I've been asking all the guests on the show, and I still haven't got a good answer on this. So Trump is about to spend $1.4 trillion refurbishing or replacing the nuclear stockpile. And I keep wondering, with the collected enriched uranium and plutonium from Russian weapons, and when I keep seeing news stories of ships floating up the Savannah River with plutonium from various countries. It's as if it's being stockpiled. But my question is, what are they going to do with the materials they remove from their existing fleet of nuclear weapons? And are they going to put that old material back in the new ones or make fresh plutonium? I mean, it seems to me, I haven't heard anything about how they plan on replacing their fleet of nuclear weapons, what they're going to do with the materials.
Well, one one important thing to mention is that the American plan actually was put forward by Obama, even though it's Trump that will move forward with it. Obama was the one who initiated the over $1 trillion spending for it. A lot of it is for delivery systems, so new subs, new planes, new missile facilities. But in terms of the weapons that are dismantled, my understanding for the United States is that most of the material, the fissile cores of these weapons, they're bunkered in the Nevada test site, which I believe has a new name, the Nevada National Defense Site. I forget exactly the new name. But the Nevada test site, which is still a very active military base, there's a large underground bunker there. And one of the things that I believe is stored there is the fissile cores of the dismantled nuclear weapon. So they're partly there for security purposes, but they're also there to be easily recycled and repurposed for new weapons. The United States, needless to say, has a massive plutonium stockpile. However, there's a strong desire in defense circles to maintain plutonium production because the future is unpredictable. So we don't want it. It would take several years in order to, and as well as the political will to begin new manufacturing of plutonium. And so it's seen as much easier to simply maintain that production throughout this period, so you don't lose the capacity to generate more plutonium were you to need it in the future. After the Cold War, there was increased funding for the nuclear weapons labs, and one of the reasons that, partly Star Wars is one of the ways this was done. Part of the idea there was that, you need to keep employing the incredibly highly trained people working in the nuclear weapons complex. You can't let them go to industry, because suddenly if you were to need new designs, new production in 10 or 20 years, because suddenly we have another nuclear adversary equal to the Soviet Union, not something like North Korea, but an actual nuclear adversary. You want to have the personnel, you want to have the production capacity, you want to have all of that intact. So the United States is not going to let those kinds of infrastructure, be it trained personnel or be it physical infrastructure, they're not going to let that become obsolete just because there's enough plutonium in the stockpile now. So, and the weapons, even though we have a lower number of weapons than we did during the peak of the Cold War, the capacity of those weapons to inflict damage is really has not been diminished at all in terms of the amount of damage the United States could inflict with its arsenal, even with a reduced number of nuclear weapons.
Hanford, it seems to be in the news just perpetually.
Yes. Hanford is going to be a tragic story for decades and decades and decades, and there's really no way around it.
And there's huge amounts stored there, and there's just, I'm just thinking back, there was whistleblower stories about stirring the contents of containers and their proximity to the environment. And I think recently the big news story was cars covered in contamination leaving the site, and it's just an ongoing.
Yes, Hanford is a disaster in so many ways. Hanford is, of course, where the United States manufactured most of its plutonium for nuclear weapons. It's the place where the very first nuclear power plants on Earth were built. Ultimately, 9 nuclear power plants were built there, and except for a very small part of the 9th reactor, they were not used to generate electricity. They were used to manufacture plutonium, which is what nuclear power plants were invented for. And because during the Cold War production era, the sensibility was that we were caught in this existential life or death struggle with the Soviet Union. And so whatever we needed to do to survive that struggle, we would deal with the fallout literally and the consequences later. And so every mistake that could be made was made at Hanford. You have thousands of sites where radioactive wastewater was just dumped in trenches. there's just a tremendous amount of waste that's just embedded into the ecosystem there. There's been some successful efforts at reclaiming this material from soil, and there's a large plume of radioactive contaminated water that has been slowly moving towards the Columbia River over decades. There's been some success at limiting that. But ultimately, there's so much waste around Hanford, so much plutonium and all kinds of other chemicals in places around Hanford, both in managed places like the tank farms that you mentioned, and also just in ditches. Yeah. That the cleanup is just going to be, it will, to say it will last decades is to be optimistic, because for it to last only decades, we're going to have to adequately fund this cleanup year after year after year. And when you have incoming administrations such as this one, which is essentially stripping departments clean, appointing people who don't have a clue what nuclear energy is, like Rick Perry, to be in charge of the Hanford site and to be in charge of the Department of Energy, the notion that the next 40 or 50 years is going to be adequately managed and funded is really hard to believe. So you have the tank farms there where a lot of radioactive material and toxic chemicals have been put into tanks. This was consciously the worst material that they had. Tanks are leaking. Many of them are leaking. There's uncertainty about what's in some of the tanks. Every year for the last 4 or 5 years, up to 70 workers a year are hospitalized because of inhaling fumes working at the tank farms, many of them with permanent disabilities. So as you can see, just the simple management of the intentional contained waste is difficult to protect workers from. Then you have other things like the Purex tunnel.
Yeah. It's a heroic act just to maintain the site as is, let alone clean it up.
Exactly. Yeah. Let alone to clean it up. Exactly. And so then you have the things that are forgotten, like the Purex tunnels. Yeah. These carried, what happened was that the spent nuclear fuel rods from all of the nuclear power plants would be transported to facilities where the plutonium would be chemically separated out from the fuel rods so that the plutonium could be used for weapons. Because the spent fuel rods were so hot, they were transported to these facilities by trains that were operated remotely because it was too radioactive for people to be on the trains. And once these operations shut down, what they did was they took these trains and these tracks going from the reactors to the plutonium extraction facilities, and they put all kinds of other contaminated materials, not like barrels of waste or anything, but heavily irradiated industrial equipment. They put a ton of this stuff on the trains. They put the train onto the track the train was on the track, and they just simply buried these in tunnels. And they basically buried them in tunnels that were made of wood, and they just put dirt on top of it. And they've been forgotten for the most part. I mean, they know they're there, but nothing has been done about these highly radioactive trains just buried in the ground. And last year, the tunnel collapsed over one of the trains, and that involved the release of radiation. Not so terrible as the tank farms, because most of it is just radioactive items rather than stuff that would spread through the air. But still, it shows the shoddy management this site has had for decades, and the fact that these problems, which have been forgotten, they're not being managed actively, just suddenly become problems again. What happened with the cars is that they're taking down the plutonium finishing plant. This is a place where the plutonium would be ultimately put into a form whereby it could be shipped to Rocky Flats and go further down the chain of producing the physical pits to be put into nuclear weapons, the plutonium pits. And in the destruction of this building, in the dismantling of this building, there's just been continual radiological releases. So it's partly because of the fact that this building is being deconstructed that you're having plutonium being scattered around, ending up on cars, spreading further and further. So this is the kind of accident that happens while there is carefully planned and managed deconstruction. There's still this kind of contamination going on. Then you have the abandoned things like the Purex tunnel that just are ongoing disasters of their own.
Am I mixing up my national labs? Is it the Hanford site that had some wildfires heading towards it a few years ago?
Absolutely, you bet. And also Los Alamos. Los Alamos had huge wildfires. And so, of course, one of the dangers you have here is that you have a lot of there's so much waste that was dumped just in trenches at Hanford that a lot of it has been taken up by tumbleweed. So tumbleweed management has been an ongoing process at Hanford. Were there to be a wildfire that crosses over these highly contaminated areas, it would aid in the redistribution and transport. It would aerosolize some of these particles, which would spread them with the smoke of the fire, across a wide area downwind. And while we've been successful in keeping the recent couple of fires over the last 5 or 10 years from crossing some of the worst contaminated areas, we're not going to be able to successfully keep wildfires from crossing it for 100 or 200 years. That material is going to be re-released because fires will cross that area eventually. And we're having a hard enough time even managing the things we are actively pouring money into, let alone remediating the tumbleweeds over vast areas. So while it's a threat that has not yet materialized, it's impossible to imagine that the radionuclides will remain dangerous for far longer than we'll be able to effectively keep wildfires from crossing those hillsides.
It's fascinating that you point out, even under perfect conditions, when we're spending tons of money on actively managed sites, there's still disasters that crop up. So I'm thinking of WIP, and the reason that WIP is so irritating to me is that up here in Canada, there's talk of this project to bury nuclear waste beside Lake Huron. And it's just interesting how they cite one or two examples, and WIP being the primary one, of a perfectly managed example of best practices and all this. And then, a few months later, there was a big event at WIP. What was that? That was a fire inside the storage?
There's been a couple of events. Yeah. There's been a couple of events at WIP where there's been barrels of nuclear waste that have exploded and caused fires and created contamination in the underground site. WIP is, if anything, an example of how quickly these projects move outside of their parameters of success. For a nuclear waste storage site like WIP, or like the sites being built for commercial waste in Finland and Sweden, the definition of failure is for radiation to be detected off-site. And in the first 20 years of operation at WIP, that's happened at least 3 times already. One of the things that we use primarily in packaging this nuclear waste is bentonite clay, which we more properly know as cat litter. And it absorbs moisture. This is partly the reason that it's used to keep moisture from corroding these canisters. And this is what is planned to be used in the deep underground spent nuclear waste, nuclear fuel sites in Sweden and Finland, which are models for how to store spent fuel, permanently store spent fuel. In one of the cases, the bentonite, the cat litter, the commercial cat litter that was used to package this nuclear waste was organic rather than processed, and that just was enough of a chemical difference that it allowed for spontaneous combustion of this material. So again, here you have at WIP, a very highly managed, highly funded site, and it's still 3 times in its first couple decades of operation having fires that cause contamination, that make parts of the site unusable, and that release radioactivity into the ecosystem outside of the site.
The Forsmark site, Chris Busby wrote a letter, an intervention, pointing out that the plan was to seal some of the waste in copper canisters, but that didn't account for off-gassing. So there's no...
Yes, there's been a lot of criticism of the copper canisters. It's not the Forsmark site and also the Onkalo site in Finland. Forsmark is just under construction, but it's just starting construction. Yeah. But Onkalo site is almost completing construction soon, and will begin to receive spent fuel. Both of them are using a method where the fuel assemblies are placed into copper canisters, and these copper canisters are then put into holes in the ground, half a kilometer underground, and it's all backfilled with bentonite clay. There's been a lot of criticism of, beyond the off-gassing, there's been a lot of criticism of the studies of erosion to copper over millennia, and how the estimates that were used by SKB, which is the Swedish utility that has designed the method that will be used in Forsmark and also in Onkalo, that the studies that they used as to how much this copper would degrade over the period of tens of thousands of years completely did not account for experimental results that have been shown that the canisters may corrode far more than was predicted by these companies. Ultimately, we're faced with this really, really horrible choice, which is we do have all of this spent fuel from all of these nuclear power plants and for plutonium production, and they have to go somewhere. There is no really good choice. Probably burying them in the deep geological, repositories a half a kilometer down. It's almost certain that will not work as planned, but there's probably not any other better alternatives at the moment. So,
well, one way of looking at it is that if you do bury it deep underground, you still have to manage. You have to be able to get down there, turn the canister around, look for rust. You have to actually be able to vent the air, and the idea of just dumping it as opposed to storing it. So the pamphlet for the OPG, DGR, the Ontario Power Generation Deep Geological Repository beside Lake Huron, the pamphlet in the first paragraph says the canisters might not last more than 300 years because they don't want to spend a lot of money on the canisters. And that, they're planning for it to be crushed by the hydrostatic pressure of the water in the rock. So, it's even questionable whether the canisters will survive the loading of the facility, let alone any time into the future.
Well, and even if the canisters did survive, you're talking time periods of 50,000 years, 100,000 years. It's insane to pretend that you can exercise technological competence into a future as long as Homo sapiens have been a species. But we extrapolate that, if we just design these canisters right, if we just figure out the right way to fill these repositories, even if the canisters decay at some point, the waste would be isolated, or even the notion that we would continue to manage in any way facilities for millennia. It's an insane projection of competence that we don't have. It's a dream. And for most of these sites, some of these sites, there is no plan for management beyond the ceiling of the repository. It is, you walk away from it at that point. And then the debate centers not around the deposit of the waste, but the debate centers around how do we communicate on the markers? How do we communicate to people in the future that there's danger here? Or even should we communicate to people in the future that there's danger here? The waste is going to go somewhere. We're going to do something with it. And I think one of the things that we need to face is that it's almost certain to be a disaster, whatever we do. We better operate with that consciously in our minds rather than fooling ourselves that somehow we're clever enough, even though we've spent, decades not adequately managing this waste, that somehow we're going to do this in a competent way. I think we need to acknowledge to ourselves right up front, the disaster has already happened, and that was the creation of this waste, and there's really no way around the fact that this disaster will affect people and the ecosystem in the future.
The favorite little punchline to the whole deep geological repository was that the very glacial scraping that created the lakes will probably reoccur in the next ice age, and speculation is it could be as deep as 300 meters deep. So in the future humans or whoever is taking over in the future, even though we're burying it 600 or 700 meters deep, it may not be that deep in the future.
And all you have to do is imagine a large meteor hitting the site. It doesn't really matter how deep you bury it. It's just the notion that we can exercise technological competence on a planetary scale for millennia is just silly.
Yeah, when you consider our track record, the math doesn't quite add up for that.
Take a look at Hanford.
Yeah.
Take a look at Hanford as an actively managed site and see how catastrophic it's been.
Yeah. Right now, there's a little disaster going on with the ruthenium, and speculation is that it's from the Mayak facility. Yeah. And isn't that the site of a very large nuclear accident in the 50s?
Yeah, 1957. Mayak is essentially the equivalent of the Soviet Hanford. It's where they manufactured plutonium.
Yeah.
And in 1957, there was a huge fire in a spent fuel pool at the Mayak site, which distributed radiation over a huge swath of area downwind from there. And it's, to this day, there's huge contamination in the villages near the Mayak site and in the rivers near the Mayak site. So it's still a very secure and guarded facility, and it's possible that when there's leaks like this that we don't have the capacity to really judge what's going on there. Yes, it was, and actually it was 3 weeks later that the huge accident at the Windscale plant in England happened.
The 50s were the real decade of accidents.
Oh, in 1957 specifically, you have two of the worst accidents in history within a month of each other, both in plutonium production sites for weapons. So the Mayak site is sort of the obvious default for mysterious radioactive releases in Central Asia.
And correct me, please. Sellafield/Windscale, and in keeping with the habit of renaming disaster sites so you don't know what you're talking about, because it was Windscale and it's now Sellafield, the installation. But that was it 11 tons of graphite and uranium on fire for 5 days with no containment and no way to stop it. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure of the actual volume specifically. I mean, I could, that's something we can go and
Google
and look up fairly easily. Yeah.
But no containment.
Well, the fire was burning inside the reactor core for 2 days. When the radioactive clouds from Chernobyl passed across parts of Europe, there are some areas in England that had been contaminated by the Windscale disaster that the British government quickly said, "Oh, here's Chernobyl contamination." And so there's some sense that it was a way of trying to sweep decades-old contamination under the rug. There's areas after the Sellafield, the Windscale accident, it's when it was called Windscale, where it's still illegal to produce dairy in those areas.
I have this vague recollection of an accident in Japan, and I can't figure out when it was. It feels like it was in the 90s, but it was a sort of smallish accident, and the news stories showed Japanese workers with buckets. Does that ring a bell? It's kind of foreshadowing.
Yes, it does, although I forget right off the top of my head. I forget exactly what that accident was.
Yeah.
But yes, that rings a bell for me too.
Another example of heroic effort.
Well, ultimately, human beings, just like the liquidators at Chernobyl, regular working class people are the people that are thrown at these disasters.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a very good documentary that was made in 1995, which you can see on YouTube, called Nuclear Ginza, Japanese documentary, but with English subtitles. And it was an examination of the people who are used for the dirtiest jobs in the nuclear industry in Japan. When you operate a nuclear power plant, the people that you have as permanent employees, you don't want them doing things where they're going to be exposed to a lot of radiation. because you're tracking how much radiation. There's a legal limit to how much radiation they can be exposed to. You don't want to take highly paid people whose expertise you need, and increase their exposures. You want to get a year's work out of them.
Yeah. So
when it comes time to clean out some of the most dirty areas that have to be cleaned annually, temporary workers are brought in because they work for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. In a sense, you don't have to care so much about if one person's exposure is so high, you have to replace it with another temporary worker. And so this documentary shows the contractors that essentially prey on the homeless people in the Osaka area to do this work annually. As one of the social workers working with this community says, in Japan, when you fall economically entirely to the bottom, if you're a woman, you go into the sex industry, and if you're a man, you go into the nuclear industry. Wow. So it's always the people who are the liquidators, the people at Fukushima, who had to do a lot of the worst things. Those are not full-time TEPCO employees, for example. These are temporary workers, and because they end up working through contractors, there's often bad records kept about who they are, where they are, what their exposures were. So there's difficulty in claiming any compensation for your exposures. It's the way the industry's operated forever.
Well, here's an example in Ontario. So we're refurbishing one of our expensive nuclear plants, Darlington, and the operator of those contractors sent everybody home to think about safety. And then rumors are floating around that management has to hand out essentially drawn pictures of how to carry out the refurbishment because very few of them speak English. So These are not highly trained people, the cream of the crop that we've got in there, turning the bolts and actually doing the work. So this is a universal thing, it seems.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, it's partly the economics of the nuclear industry. You don't want people who you pay well to have increased exposures beyond their daily exposures.
Another interesting thing was at Bruce Power, I'm sure the rest of the reactors in Ontario, they always tout their perfect safety record, but they don't consider exposure to radiation as an at-work accident. It goes on and on.
Well, that's another example of technopolitics.
Yeah.
The safety culture in some, utility operators is good, but in others it's very shoddy. When you have commercial nuclear power operated as a for-profit enterprise, obviously in a market-driven mentality, you are always looking to reduce costs. And with a nuclear plant, one way you reduce costs is by reducing how vigorously you maintain safety standards. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plants were not the closest nuclear plants to the epicenter of the earthquake. It's just that the safety culture of TEPCO was much shoddier than other operators in Japan.
Wow.
And so their plants couldn't stand that earthquake, even while plants that were closer did.
I remember seeing photos of the concrete work around the plants in the weeks after or months after, and it all looked cracked and rusty and handrails or just rusting, and it didn't look like a state-of-the-art facility.
TEPCO had been taken to court for falsifying records about safety procedures in the past. I mean, they had a terrible safety culture in that company.
Vogel. Will they cancel Vogel? Because Hinckley and Vogel and VC Summer till they killed it, one of the excuses why we can't seem to build a nuclear reactor anymore is sort of similar to what you were talking about before. There was a brain drain, or that those people have left the industry. We haven't really been building plants for decades. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that at this point, we have a pretty terrible record of bringing new plants in the United States and the West online. Mm-hmm. It's fairly easy to imagine that at some point the companies may walk away from these investments, or so they pass the cost on. But the same thing. There's a third plant being operated in the, I forget exactly how to pronounce it, Olkiluoto site where the Onkalo underground storage is in Finland. There's 2 nuclear power plants there. There's a third one being built largely by Areva, the French company, and the cost overruns are partly what is, bankrupting Areva. So again, to actually believe that they will finally come online, it's almost impossible given the past track record of the industry to believe that it would not involve cutting some corners in order to square that circle. So the real question is, will these plants come online adequately built and prepared for the work ahead of them?
The pro-nuclear would point to China and Russia and say they're pumping them out like jelly beans, but we don't get to see their books.
No, and what's more, pumping them out like jelly beans doesn't mean that 40 years from now they will all be well-digested jelly beans.
Right.
Pumping them out quickly is probably not a good thing in this industry.
Do you have anything you want to add?
The work that I do,
yeah.
A lot of the focus that I try to have is on people on the ground who have suffered exposures to radiation and the way those populations are managed.
Huh.
And a lot of my work has been at nuclear test site communities. The UK never tested inside the UK. France never tested inside France. The places where the nuclear states do nuclear testing is in marginal areas or colonial areas or post-colonial areas. The people there are exposed to fallout. They don't have the same experience as people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're exposed to residual radiation, to particles, and they're ignored. The health problems they have are largely ignored. And I had thought that when Fukushima happened, now you have a large amount of people in a modern, highly technological, wealthy nation having a similar exposure to the people in the test site communities. And I had hoped that this might bring more attention to the plight of people who are suffering from residual radiation, from fallout. But it's just really not happened at all. And the people in Fukushima are being forgotten as quickly as the people in Kazakhstan and the people in French Polynesia and the people in the Marshall Islands. My work focuses on people like this. No matter how many treaties we sign, no matter how much money we put into recovery of Fukushima, the people that are exposed to radiation just end up being completely forgotten.
And mining sites as well? Indigenous population?
That's a perfect example. You bet. The Dene community in Africa, uranium miners in the American Southwest, the actual people affected by radiation are just disposed of by our society, and it continues to be a scandal.
Where can we read more about that?
A lot of the work that I've done is based around that. And 7 or 8 years, I've been operating a project called the Global Hibakusha Project with a colleague of mine, Dr. Mick Broderick from Australia. And we've done a lot of oral history gathering among radiation-affected populations, communities living near test sites, soldiers that took part in tests, people near nuclear accident sites. And so right now I'm in the middle of producing a book based on some of the outcomes of that work and some additional work. So I'll have a book out in a year or two that is essentially focused really very much on these populations. But meanwhile, I've got a few articles out.
And your webpage, which we'll put a link to at the end, also has a section where your books are listed, so people can look
Absolutely,
at those.
Yeah. And there's links also to articles and some lectures, videos of lectures.
Excellent. Wow, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. It's great to talk to you. Great to finally meet up.
Yeah. Maybe we'll have you on again if there's issues that come up or you write an article or something you want to talk about. Feel free to send an email and we'll tee up another chit chat.
Oh, that sounds great. I'll do that. You bet. And keep up the good work. It's the podcast's great, and the stuff that you post on Twitter is always fascinating.
Thanks. I might be the only person in Canada doing an anti-nuclear podcast. I'm not really sure about that, but I've been told that might be true.
So, certainly the only one I know of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and the Americans have the nuclear hot seat. That's a good one.
Yes, absolutely, you bet. Yeah, although there's only a couple. There's a handful of pro-nuclear podcasts. But there's, I think you and Nuclear Hot Seat are the only ones I really think of when I think of, anti-nuclear podcasting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't want them to outnumber us too much, but pro-nuclear.
The nuclear industry has a lot of people on payrolls doing public relations.
Right.
Our side, everybody's operating independently for the most part. And so, yeah, I agree with you. There's simply, once we had this conference here in Hiroshima, and this one scholar said, what would be interesting would be to have somebody who thinks that the attack was good because it ended the war and have a debate about that. And I'm thinking, you know what? This is a community of survivors, and they're really not interested in being told how it was great that their families were killed.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, less severe example is, we're all paying for it. We're already sort of, Ontario here, where we have 20 nuclear reactors. Yeah. We're already victims of it, and they've got huge budgets to promote it, and they lie in their advertisements, and they place ads in newspapers who are starving for revenue already. And we never nobody knows anything about nuclear in Ontario. We're surrounded by nuclear. I will never get over that. Yeah. It's by design. Yeah, I think that there's, huge PR apparatus. And there's been plenty of debates by experts on both sides. It's not beholden on those of us working on the margins, as it were, to somehow relitigate those things, rather than to get some air to people who, as you say, have thought it through and worked out their own understandings and stand in an oppositional point. Another thing I'll never understand is, you mentioned the Cold War and this sort of anti-Russian fear, I'll throw in the McCarthy era, and how we find ourselves in this particular discussion about collusion with the Russians, and his base just seems to love him more and more. And yet we spent the last 100 years afraid of the Russians, and now it's okay if they're suspected of colluding with them. I don't understand that. Well, it's funny, but it shows you how silly those lines we drew between us and the Russians were. That we're the free world and they're advocating communism, and that's the reason we have to go to war with them or prepare for war with them. In this case, in my mind, when I look at the way in which certain segments of Russian society and certain segments of American society have found comfort in each other, it's mostly around tribal identity of white nationalist Christianity. Interesting. It's the people on the right in America that like the Russians are people who have those sympathies. A lot of the people who are feeling towards the Republican Party within Russia are people who are also advocating white nationalist pride and the notion that Christianity is under siege by Islam. That's an interesting take on that. Yeah, when you see this growing all over a lot of parts of Europe, this same sort of fascist movement, it's the thing that holds together this fascist movement in all these different countries where they used to hate each other because of nationality. Now they're internationalizing, and it's based on anti-Islam and a notion of white culture being under attack. That's fascinating. Well, thank you again for speaking to us, and I'd love to have you back on. Oh, it's my pleasure. I think it's a great interview. It was really great talking to you. Oh, it was great talking to you.
That was Robert A. Jacobs, Ph.D., professor at Hiroshima City University, Hiroshima Peace Institute, graduate faculty of International Studies in Japan. His webpage, bojacobs.net, for his books, many articles, and contact info. Find him on Twitter, @BoJacobs.
Professor Robert Jacobs has written Reimagining Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Images of the Rupture Between East and West, Fixing a Hole in the Nuclear Future, and The Dragon's Tail, Americans Face the Atomic Age, an exploration of nuclear narratives in early Cold War America. Find them on Amazon. It's a bit stressful these days. Yeah.
As an American, even on in Japan, it feels like, the things that seem solid and established in my country are falling apart quickly. So we just signed this treaty at the UN, but the world seems closer to the use of nuclear weapons than ever. Scary times.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Yeah. Take care, you too.
This has been TMI.